developing web applications, sometimes difficult enough, but with Angular, we have the Angular CLI that helps us to generate code for our workspace, projects, services, components, classes, etc. So why not generate code yourself? You can take advantage of the Angular Schematics and Nx to actually create your own schematics or your own code generator to generate your own code. Let's get started. Okay, what we're going to do today is something that I've been interested in doing for almost a year now and just haven't really got to it. But you know, I have some extra time to be at home recently, so what I'm doing is going to just create this video and just kind of walk you through. Workspace schematic is different from just a normal schematic because we don't have to build or package this schematic in order to use it. So we eliminate a lot of the steps involved in developing schematics. So where do we start and how do we begin? Well, one of the first things we want to make sure is we have the right packages available that allows us to basically create schematics. So one of the things we want to do is we want to install the Schematics CLI from Angular Dev Kit as well as Schematics and Core. So we'll install those three packages. I've already done that, so all you need to do is run yarn or npm and add those packages basically, and you want to do a --dev to make sure that they're put in your dev dependencies. And the last one that we want is the @schematics Angular package. And this one is an important one because it contains some utilities and some other things that are very useful in developing our schematic projects. So once we have those packages, we're ready to go. And really, I'm making the assumption here that you're familiar with Nx. If you're not familiar with Nx Workspace, it's basically just a kind of an add-on or sits right on top of the Angular Workspace and just gives us some additional capabilities. We know that it is very opinionated in some ways in terms of like, where do we put our apps? It's in the apps folder. Where do we put libs? In the libs folder. So when we're talking about schematics, where do we put schematics? Probably in the schematics folder, right? And you're probably wondering where that is. If you look in an Nx Workspace, under Tools, there is a schematics folder. So we're getting there, right? We have what we need to basically start creating schematics. One thing that you could do though, just to make sure that you have installed everything properly, is after you installed the schematics CLI, you can run the schematics --help, and you should see help, yes, right? And one of the options that we have is to list available schematics. So we can actually start playing around with schematics without even making our own, right? So all we need to do is use an existing normal one. So all right, so let's get into it. One of the things that we're going to do is basically create that, and we're going to use Nx Workspace, and we're targeting our workspace schematic for a domain service. No, we're not generating that, right? We actually want to create not a domain service but a domain library project, right? So we're going to rename that, and so I'm just going to do a dry run and hit enter. Which is really nice about dry run is, or -d for that, is basically it'll show you what the result would have been without modifying the file system. So when we're using a CLIs, it's basically using schematics. And so we're going to create our own, and we'll see why that's important later to be able to do dry runs when we're creating this. So what we're going to do is create a workspace schematic. And there we go. So it's named domain library. It has two files that have been created, a schema file and an index file, right? So let's take a look at those. So we go to our tools schematics folder. We have domain library folder now. Here's our two files. We have a schema file. And a schema file is basically defines what the options are for your schematic. So in this case, we have one property name, And we know on other schematics that we use with the Angular CLI that there are multiple options, right? So basically, those options are defined as properties within the schema file. And then our index file is a function that's really the entry point into our schematic that basically returns a rule, because it could be called by something else, and maybe that would continue to be used. But the entry point here takes in that schema that we were just looking at, and notice in our example here that it's actually not strongly typed, but it's just basically an any, right? We can take care of that by let's just terminal in to the specific folder, and what we want to do is we're going to use the npx command. Basically, it's going to use this DTS generator package, target our schema JSON file, and output a schema type definition file. So we'll go ahead and hit enter on that. Take a moment. All it's going to do is basically output our file. So now we have this file, and it's an interface called domain library. We can actually change that to export, and it has our name property that we want, right? And it's called domain library. I'm going to rename it domain library options. Go to our index here. It's not being used, but we know it's being referenced. Oh, we don't want that one. Hold on here. So basically, it's compiling that somewhere. All right. So now it's targeting our schema file. So we're good there. So we basically can supply a name, and basically it's going to use the Nx Workspace schematic. And it's an external schematic. So this chain command here basically allows us to chain any number of rules together to output some kind of composition of what we want to do. So we can basically use a whole set of schematics, which all return rules and such, and take in the options that we just looked at. So let's see if this works. We're going to just save everything. We're not even going to compile our application because we don't need to. So what we want to do is target this domain library schematic, and we already generated it. So let me get our run command here. So what we want to do is give it a name. Let's just call it new lib1, and we want to do a dry run. So what we're doing, we're going to do a yarn run. We're targeting a workspace schematic domain library. That's the name of the schematic that we have over here, right? And then when we generate it, we want to create a library called new lib1, okay? And there is no project because we're actually creating a library. So we'll just remove that. Dry run. So what it's going to do, the schematic is basically going to create a library project for us. And if we didn't have the dry run flag on there, basically all of these files would have been created, and these 3 files in our workspace would be updated. So tsconfig would get a new path entry for our new library. Angular JSON would get all of the project information in there, and Nx JSON would have the name of the new project added to our workspace. So it's working. We didn't even compile it, and we actually could create these files now if we wanted, but we're not going to do that just yet, because what we want to do, this is going to be something where we're actually creating a new library, and this library will have a module, right? And this library is also going to have a service that acts as an API. So what we're doing here, I'm using an architecture that's very layered, and it has a nice separation of concerns between the UI, the presentation layer, and the business layer. So what we have are a set of basically library projects that implement the business logic for our application domains, the domain features, right? So if we have domains, feature domains like orders, shipments, products, customers, each one of those would have a domain library. And there's a lot of files involved, and it takes time, and it could be error prone, and I want a specific format of those files and architecture that I've been working with for quite a while now. So it's well defined, it's maintainable, it's consistent, it's reliable, so it's ready to become a schematic template, so I can use it to just basically generate domain libraries all day long with just my CLI. So that's what we want to do here, and that's kind of the intent of doing this. So one of the things that we're going to do is basically modify our template here to create a module. So the next thing we want to do is we want to do the external schematic again. So we'll do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to give it the actual collection name of the schematic, and then we want to create a module. And the collection name that we're going to target here is the Angular Schematics, right? And we have one more thing that we need to pass in, right? We need to pass in our options. And the options are basically, we want our name, right? So we know that it's part of our, or do we rename that yet? No, we still call it schema. So let's rename that to options. And then options.name is there. And if we want to make sure there's a project there, and we don't think we have that, but we can add it. Options.project, right? And it's complaining. It's like it doesn't belong there. It doesn't want to add it. Let's declare it. And so if we go there, it's declared. We probably want to put it under our name, right? So it's working in this manner here of our options interface. And what we're going to do is our project schemas and add those. So in the resources for this the video here, we'll actually show you where to find those, and then you can create your own or look at these example schematics that have all the different properties here for the options that we're going to use. So we have a project option, right? And we're going to need that. So if we go back to our domain library here, now it'll be there, right? Oh, what else do we need here if we're going to create this domain library? So one of the things I'll run it without it just to show you what's going to happen here, and then we'll save these. So we're going to run our yarn command to call the schematic from the collection that we're working with. It creates this domain library. It's running now. Specified project does not exist. Oh, because we didn't add it to our options, right? So that's the thing about these schematics is they basically use what you pass in. Create a new one. There we go. And what we're going to do is we already have the name, and we know the name's going to be new lib 1, right? Now if we pass that in, it'll be there. But say you really didn't want to put that there because it doesn't belong there, and then you have to, what if they type it in wrong and such? It's just not going to work, right? So I think a better option would be to basically use the name value for our project, and we'll call --rise options.name, right? And what doesn't it like? It just doesn't like how it looks. It's an odd name, right? So what we can do is we could save this. And so what we're doing is we're kind of encapsulating some of the options here for our schematic. And the only thing that we need to really pass in currently is the name, which is kind of cool. It makes it a lot easier, right? because you don't have to dasherize on a command line. I'm going to run that, and it's not going to complain anymore because we are supplying the project to the module schematic, which is required because it needs to know where to put that module. All right, good. So what we have here is, here's our module. And we notice it put it in a folder called newlib1. If we wanted to just put it in the root of the library, the other thing we could do is just add some more options here. So flat true, save that. And if we run it again, it's going to create the same files, but they're going to be located differently. All right, so our module is now in the root. Okay, so currently our schematic is doing pretty well, and we haven't really written a lot of code to do this. We're basically taking advantage of calling other schematics using the external schematic method to do that, and passing in the options, and really the only thing we have is the name, right? So we're good. So the last thing we want to do is to create a service schematic, and this one is going to be customized. And so we're going to use a different item here. We're going to use schematic, and it wants a name, right? And it's going to want some options, and some of the options we can do this. So we could say the name is going to be dasherize that options name, right? And same with the project, right? Kind of the same from above. If you don't like the type, you can just copy and paste, which works for me. Flat is true, and we're not going to need tests for this one. A reason for it, it's basically a lot of pass-through code for the service, but we'll have tests in our templates, right? So we don't have a schematic template yet. So right now we have a domain library, and what we want to create is a domain service. So I'm going to name it domain service. All right, the schematic doesn't exist. So if we try to run it, it's probably going to say, hey, there's no schematic named domain service in this collection. Yep, domain service wasn't found in the collection. We knew that. So what we're gonna do is actually create our domain service. So basically, we use nx generate, and we're using our collection of workspace schematics, and we're gonna create a domain service. And remember, it's just gonna create an index file and a schema file, schema JSON file. All right, there we are. So we have our two files. So really, we kind of have our setup for this. So what I've done is I basically went to the Angular schematic for a service and kind of looked at that code. Very flatteringly, I basically just copied it to my schematic service, right? So I can just do what's good here. So I'll show you what I did. So basically, the code in the Angular project basically had a utility folder that had all of the utilities required, for example, to parse the name, which is used right here. If we want to create the default path, it's used there. If we want to apply a lint fix, it's right here. So what's going on is we can actually take advantage of the package at Schematics Angular, and in the utility folder of that package, we have these corresponding utilities available for us. So we're good there. And there is no domain service options schema yet, right? So we can kind of do the same. And what I'm going to do is just copy and paste again. And we'll change that ID. So it's a domain service. All right. And the one thing that we didn't do is, what we want to do is strongly type that. So let's go ahead and terminal there, and we just want our npx command to our DTS generator, hit enter. It's all about tools, right? All right. I want to rename this to domain service options. If we go to our index, we got domain service options. It knows where to find all this stuff, so we're good. Our options are named options, so we're passing those all the way through. And really, this template isn't too complex. What it's doing, basically, it's in the same format. It's a entry function, returns a rule. It has the tree that represents the file system. And basically what we're doing is trying to determine what the path is so that it can parse that path, create the actual parse path, and then if we're doing skip test, we're going to exclude the files that end in template or spec test template. And then we're going to apply these templates, and we're going to pass in some string utilities and all the options, so it has all those options. And we probably could have did that earlier with the dot options, and then add the new ones in the previous index files. So we can go back and do that if we want to clean up that code a bit. And then what it's going to do is it's going to return the merge of the previous changes with these new changes based on the templates. So one of the things that it's doing is it's looking at a folder called files, which we don't see yet. And by convention, most schematic developers are using a files folder to contain the templates that they want to use. So remember, schematics, really 80 to 90% of the time, or even more, schematics are creating things. They're creating code for your projects, for your modules, for your for the applications that we're working with. And so what code is generated is really based on templates, and the information we pass in based on the options and what can derive from that, it basically will use that against the template and then output like a component, a spec file for that component, a service, a spec file for the service, etc., etc. So we basically have all these template files. Well, in the environment where I'm working, I would create my library with a module, add a service, add a folder, add a business service that's injectable, that implements the business logic, and then I have business actions. I have a repository class that handles all the API calls and such. There's a spec test class for that as well, a file for that. And there's some base files for the action and a base file for the business provider, et cetera, a lot of files. And if you had to remember how that all worked and what files you needed while you're creating a domain service, you might miss something or forget something. So once you have something well-defined in your architecture, it's maintainable, it's consistent, it's reliable, it works, it's functional, you've exercised it in your applications, it's tested, you know it works, you can use those files or those items as a start for templates, right? And that way, then you could basically generate, instead of creating those templates one-off for your implementation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to target the domain service folder, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste in a files folder, and then we'll walk through these templates and kind of give you an idea of what's going on. Remember, one of the options is flat. If something is flat, it's not going to create a folder for it. So it's not going to create a folder for the name, the option name, if flat is false. If it is true, then it will create that. And what it's going to do is it's going to use the dasherize utility function with the name and create a dasherized name that you passed in. And then it's going to put the contents in there. So in this case, we have a service file. It's basically a service class using the name we passed in on our options, and another utility called classify. and that's probably coming from the strings utilities that we passed in there. And then the rest of this stuff is just boilerplate template, right? And then I pass in this, so we see a little error here. So what we need to do is just add in the actual name here, and I wanted a classify name. So that'll fix that template. Do we see any other things we need to test? So what we're doing is this syntax here that works with the options that you pass in, and the utilities is kind of a razor syntax. There's probably a different name for it globally, but basically it's percent equals with the brackets that allows us to encapsulate that that interpolation, what's going to happen there. So that's all we need to do. So we could have hello world, or we could have an actual class with everything with its injectable decorator, and then all of its imports, etc. Right? And then even a test file for that specific service, and by that same name, right? So it's looking pretty good. So that's what that looks like. And if you notice, if you want to add the name of the file, the syntax is underscore underscore prefixed and suffixed, and then use the variable name at the utility name. So name at dasherize, and what it'll do is it'll dasherize that name value there for those files. Right? So now we have other files. We have a business folder, and we have basically a business service template. And notice all the templates end in .template by convention, so they know they're templates. And if your file name has a specific name that you want to use from your options, you have to use the underscore underscore name at dasherize. And then basically I have a repository service, which basically is making the HTTP calls for the application. And then what calls that are the business actions. So the business action template implements the actual business logic. We have a rule engine that we run validation rules, data validation rules, business rules. If everything's good, we call it API service, and it returns a result, so we'd uncomment that. And the API service is this repository service that belongs to the business provider. So this all works. We know it works. So all we need to do now is generate and see if our new template files actually create all of what we need here. Yarn run, domain library, new lib1, right? And if we recall, we don't need to pass in the project information anymore, because we're actually dasherizing that within the template. So, all right, or the function. So here we go. We're going to just run this. And so what it's going to do now is create our library project. It's going to add a module to the library project. And then it's going to create the service, which it did. And then it's going to create all of our business files from our templates, and then our 2 action files in the action folder in those templates. So it created all these files for us. So we have a library, and we have a new library with a module and a service and all these implementations for interacting with our web APIs and such in less than 10 seconds. That's pretty cool. So really, that is really the power of schematics in the creation schematics, because they can scaffold code very quickly for you. So once you have the point where you can actually define what your templates are going to be, you just put them in the files folder, you fix them up with the prefix suffix if you want to name them, dasherize that name, and then you're just updating the internals using utilities to basically classify or dasherize a name inside the actual templates. And then the rest is just your boilerplate code around in your template, specific to how you want to build your application. So did we do a... we actually ran this without a dry run. So really now, if we go to our libs folder, we should have a new library with all this code, and it's ready to go, right? Should be ready to go. We should be able to build it. So I don't know, let's do ng build -s project equals Every time you try to do stuff like this in a tutorial or demo, it's not going to work the first time. Yeah, here we go. It doesn't support the build target. Oh. Yeah, so this is the new template for libraries from the Angular Workspace or Nx Workspace. They're not publishable, so they're just sourced for other libraries and other application projects. So if we really wanted to, we can actually take a look at that real quick. It's kind of interesting. So if we look in our projects, it's probably at the bottom. Here it is. Now, it's a library project, and we're going to look in the architect node, but there's no build configuration. So that's why it's not there. So if we wanted to build it, the only reason why you would want to build a library is if you're going to publish it. And then you want to use ng packager, so you're going to use the build ng packager setup, and then you could do it that way. So, but by default, when you're in a Narwhal Nx workspace, you really don't have to build your libraries, and you don't have to build your schematics. So just re-emphasize that point. It eliminates that workflow for you and allows you to be more efficient and more effective by focusing on development of features and working code. And then we don't have to kind of fiddle with building, deploying, and then consuming libraries, or trying to build and deploy and consume schematics, which would be even much more different. So we see now that our schematics really become like another tool. The schematics are like a great tool in the tool belt here in your Angular workspace, the Nx workspace. And we have lots of capabilities. So we can actually just recap here. We have a domain library. We're using existing schematic collections from Narwhal to create a library. Calling external schematic. We used one from the Angular Schematics to create a module. And then we called a custom one that we added to our schematics collection here. And that's the one that we detailed out with all these files, right? That's pretty cool. And all we do is just call it by schematic, and it passes in the options here. So that's it. Basically, one entry point file for building a domain library. And now all you need to do is basically use the refactoring tools from your UI services to the domain service, and you can build out all of the functions and operations that you need to detail each of these domain services.